I am going to introduce Erik Berg, who's our topic talk speaker here today. And he has given us permission of a very abbreviated bio, but I'm sure he'll fill in the blanks. So Erik graduated from William & Mary with a double major in finance and public policy in 2016 and received his MBA from the University of Pennsylvania with a major in entrepreneurship and innovation in 2022. Erik spent the early part of his career as an investor in private equity and then venture capital before his experience working on and at multiple startups. Currently, he is a product manager at Capital One. Outside of his work, Erik enjoys reading, playing board games, writing, watching his favorite team, his soccer team, Arsenal. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Erik. Erik, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no problem. Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share some of my experience over my career with all of you.
It probably needs to be on, click on the side.
There you go. Working in tech, turns out, doesn't make you that was, but let's. There you go.
See if you're good now.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit more background on myself and why I can talk about some of these things a little bit. And then I'm going to do a kind of intro overview of venture capital and how that works, because that is definitely the most popular way or most known and discussed way to fund entrepreneurial ventures, and talk about what it's actually like raising from VCs, having been both a VC and someone pitching to VCs before. And then I'm going to talk about some alternatives to venture. Okay, so why you should listen to me, besides the fact that I broke out my VC uniform from back in the day. Actually, I prefer maybe just don't completely ignore me, is the better way to look at it. But I have experience over my career, both as an investor. I've also invested in a lot of startups as an angel. So I've been on the institutional and angel side. Also have operating experience at startups. And currently I'm a product manager at Capital One. So hopefully that's enough to say you'll at least give me a chance on some of my perspectives here. And also I am a William & Mary entrepreneurship alum. So a couple of fun William & Mary facts, that is my wife and I at a homecoming parade while I was here. And then most recently we just had our first kid. I did propose on the Crendel. It was very cheesy. All the like classic William & Mary tropes we kind of hit while we were here, which was a lot of fun. Okay, so how venture capital works. Okay, this is kind of obvious, but given the presentation, but what do all of these companies have in common? Anyone shout it out? They all raised venture capital. Yeah, they were probably also fair to say at some point startup, though I think depending on your definition of that, that could get a little fuzzy with a couple of them. But yeah, they all raised significant venture capital, and they're all massive companies today to varying degrees. My definition of venture capital is a form of financing where capital is invested into a startup or small business with high growth potential in exchange for explicit or implicit minority ownership. To highlight a couple things. So financing, this is money that is being pumped into the startup or small business, and high growth potential is really important. That is why venture capitalists invest in these companies, because they expect them to grow. And explicit or implicit minority ownership. So this is important. We'll probably talk about this a little bit more. Not every instrument that venture capitalists use is purely an equity instrument, buying equity in a company. But if they're not, they kind of act like that. So explicitly or implicitly, they're buying a piece of your business. So how do VCs make money? Two ways. Management fees. Or I want you to remember, this is how VCs get paid. So 2% of assets under management. So if they raise $1 million fund, 2% of that gets paid out. That's how they pay their salaries, they rent their office space, they pay for junior level VCs like me, and it's really important. You're going to see this incentive. I have it marked with a little emoji as we go through the slides. And I'll call it out now, and I'll keep calling it out. Because as you think about raising money for your venture, I really want you to put yourself in the place of these VCs and think about what their incentives are. VCs in general get a lot of airtime and suck up a lot of oxygen in the room. People talk about the industry a lot, and they can be a little mysterious from the outside looking in, but if you understand the incentives they're working through, everything they do makes sense. And so this is the first one. So if you get paid based on how much money you manage, what's your incentive? To manage more and more and more money. And so it's very rare that you'll see a venture capital firm that doesn't progressively raise more and more money, because that allows them to hire more people and all sorts of stuff. So that's very important. Roughly 2%, but that can vary depending on the prestige of the firm and that sort of thing. And then carry. This is, like, for such an innocuous name, like, this is the name of the game. This is what gets people excited. So the way venture capitalists are incentivized is that they get 20% of the upside in a company. So after they have made their investors whole on their money, they get 20% on top of that of any gain. And so this is what I want you guys to remember is this is how VCs get rich. If they get some big, if they invest early in any of the companies that you saw on a prior slide, that fund is making magnitudes more on carry than they did in their management fees. But the interesting thing about it, even though this drives so much of the behavior in the industry, most VCs will never in their career receive a check from carry. It's relatively rare, and the reason why is that funnel on the side. This funnel is, this is a few years old, but the same dynamics are at play. It just kind of shows you how unlikely it is, what the failure rate is or the exit rate is at various stages of financing. And really where carry comes into play is at these later rounds of financing. That's really what VCs are targeting. They're going for the grand slams. They don't make money off of hitting a first or second, to use the sports metaphor. They make money off the very, very, very few companies that make a massive return. And so that's, even if the most VCs don't ever receive carry, this is what they're aiming for. So that's that incentive again, own a very small portion of a company that goes absolutely supernova. Okay, I'm going to talk about maybe the most boring slide on this presentation, but it's super important. VC fund mechanics. Again, this is where a lot of their incentives come into it. I'll explain it. I'll also share these slides so you can kind of refer back to this. But it's really important to understand how these things are structured. So there's really three players in a venture capital firm. You have the general partner. These are the VCs. They have a little bit of skin in the game, but really all they largely care about is getting multiples on their investments, getting that carry, like we talked about again. You have your limited partners. These are the quote unquote investors. They're the ones who invest in the VC fund. And they are a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily expect if you pictured a tech investor in your head. There's a lot of endowments from universities, nonprofits, pensions, firefighter, police, union. Probably the biggest investors I've ever worked with was the Alaska State Pension Fund. California is a massive investor in venture capital funds. Also high net worth individuals, and then fund of funds, which are investors that invest in other investment funds. They make up a large pool of capital as well. And what they care about is IRR. And I highlighted this because this is a big difference. The first one, MOIC, multiple on invested capital. VCs generally care about what that multiple is. Did they 2x? Did they 3x? Did they 10x an investment? But what limited partners care about is IRR. For anyone who's taken like Finance 201 in the business school, I think it was when I was here, there's a time value of money element here. So the distinction here is that this takes into account opportunity costs. So these pension funds, these endowments, they can invest in stock markets, they can invest in hedge funds, they can invest in private equity. And so they need to justify the return they're seeing from venture capital as an asset class compared to all those other opportunities they have to invest. So just something to call out there. And then the third piece of the puzzle is the fund. A couple things that it's super important to understand about venture capital funds. They're limited life investment vehicles. So you are only allowed, there's a contract, VCs are only allowed to invest out of a specific fund for a limited amount of time, generally 3 to 4 years as an investment period. After that, they cannot invest any more out of that fund in new companies. And so there's a big incentive here. You generally will see, and if you follow fundraising for VC firms, they will start raising money as soon as this period is over. So before their companies have exited, before they actually have any returns, before we even know if they make good investments, they're already out in the market raising their next fund, which is kind of interesting. Then in the later years, you have a period where their investments hopefully grow, and then they're hopefully sold for multiples of what they invested in. Another incentive to call, and this one's kind of tough. Like VCs in general, they may not say this, but they would rather your company either go to 20x or 0x. The worst thing for a VC is to have zombies in their portfolio, is what we affectionately refer to them as. These are the companies that just sort of limp along and are making enough money to stay in business, but are never ever going to return you money because they oftentimes can take up just as much time and effort and energy as your total grand slam company if you let them. And it has a whole pain of like, once you get towards the end of the life cycle of the fund, you have to get exceptions to extend it and that sort of thing if you have a lot of these zombies limping on. So another incentive to call out there. Feel free to ask questions as well. I'm going to try to like run through these slides so there's time for questions at the end, but stop me, ask questions if you have them. Any questions on?
Yeah, the fund, how are they raising money? Like, what's that doing? Where does that go into?
Yeah, so the fund raises money from, well, basically the fund is just an investment vehicle. So the general partner, the VCs, they raise money from the limited partner or the investors, and it gets pooled in this vehicle that we refer to as the fund. And then the fund is actually what's making the investments in the startup companies. So it's not really accurate to think of it as like, there's not just a pool of money sitting somewhere, but basically it's a contract that they are allocated a certain amount of money, and then they make what's called capital calls, and they'll ask their investors, hey, send us the money you told us because we have this investment that we want to invest in. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, is it like shares in the companies or like these people are giving them money, like in addition to what they make in their company, or it's like a part of what they make that they're giving?
Yes, so it is largely the easiest way to think of it is equity ownership. So they are purchasing a small piece of the company. So they, and it's shares usually, or some kind of structure that looks like shares, but that's the easiest way to think of it. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go. Next slide. No, you're good. Yeah. Okay, cool. So as part of this, having worked in the venture industry, I sent this deck to one of my good friends who still is a VC and is actively investing. So I added some of his commentary on this deck that he sent me. And so this was his view on portfolio construction, on how he tries to spend his time. He tries to spend at least a third, or have a third of his portfolio on track to make at least a 5x return. And that's where he tries to invest all his time and energy, and him and his firm are going to follow on to those investments. Probably about a third of his portfolio, he wants to help out and move towards an exit, but they're not really going to make him a ton of money. And then about a third of his portfolio is not going to make any money at all. And these are these zombies that you really want to be careful, or they're probably going to go out of business, but you want to make sure they're not zombies, and you want to think about how you're investing your time and energy and money into them. This mix can change depending on where you are, but I think this is a good general rule of thumb. Okay, venture math. The second most boring slide I have in this presentation, but I promise, as a VC, this is all the math you need to know as a venture capitalist is on this slide, which I think is pretty good if you compare it to like any other career in finance. A couple of things to call out. The big one is this first equation I have. The pre-money valuation of a company plus the investment amount equals the post-money valuation. There's not like a good name for this equation. I think we need to like brand this as like the golden rule of VC or something like that, because everything else is basically built off this one equation. So these other ones are basically derivatives of the top one, but it allows you to say, okay, this is how much of the company that you're buying, right? So if you take the post-money valuation, which is the valuation of the startup after the investment, and you divide it by the investment amount, that's going to give you how much of the company you just bought. Important thing to think about, this sounds super obvious, but actually it like took me a while to really wrap my head around the implications. $1 is always worth $1. So if you're investing today and your fund is investing $1 million today, that $1 million tomorrow should be worth $1 million. So sounds kind of obvious, but when you think that was like a helpful light bulb moment for me to understand that, like, why is investment amount always valued at the dollars invested, because a dollar always equals a dollar. And then the other thing I'll call out is like when you're calculating shares purchased, price per share, this sort of thing, fully diluted shares outstanding. So the amount of stock after a transaction, assuming everything converts. There are all sorts of crazy vehicles, convertible notes, different structures that VCs use to make their investments. But at the end of the day, whenever we're doing the math behind it, we look at fully diluted shares outstanding to understand what you were saying, what ownership do they own, how if we converted all our shares, all our instruments tomorrow, what would the ownership structure look like? Any questions on the venture math? Sure.
How do you get a valuation of the company if there's no investment in it yet? What are they basing it on? Just the idea or?
Vibes, nothing but vibes. It's actually like a really interesting question, and there's a lot of nuance to it. It's a negotiation. When you as an entrepreneur are going to a VC, you're going to say, hey, I think my company should be valued at $5 million. Here's why. Here's how I'm going to justify it. And then the VC is going to come back to you and say, honestly, for a company at your stage, with this amount of traction, we usually value those companies at $3 million. And then you kind of negotiate from there. So it's kind of depending on what industry you're in, what geography you're in. When I was, the VC firm I worked at was in Ohio. So Midwest valuations, very different than Bay Area valuations. So it all kind of depends on the traction you have, the industry you're in, where you're located geographically, it all goes in. So there's not a clean formula for valuation. Without getting too deep in the weeds, generally what you'll want to see is each progressive round, you'll want to see the valuation going up. The way that a lot of these instruments are structured, there are a lot of disincentives to have what's called a down round, where you value a company at X, and then the next round you value it at 0.5X. That is really mostly harmful to the entrepreneur, but also in some ways to VCs. And so it's kind of an art. It may be tempting to think, oh, I want as high of a valuation as I can. Actually, what you want is as accurate of a valuation as you can. You get into a lot of issues if your valuation is lower than it should be, or if it's way higher than it should be, but it's much more art than science. Is that helpful? Cool. Okay, so that was like your crash course on venture. I promise there's no more math. What is actually like raising from VCs? Okay, so these are some of the big incentives I wanted to call out. I've talked about a couple of them. Raising their next fund, carry, no zombies. But there are also 3 others that I want to make sure you're thinking about if you're going to raise capital from VCs. Reputation for VCs is everything. Because if you have a good reputation, you get the best deal flow. And then it becomes this virtuous cycle where you're seeing the best startups because the best startups want you to invest with them. And it just, the rich kind of get richer. And how do they do that? A couple ways. Logos, especially for VC firms working on their first fund. Because their investment period, like I mentioned, they have to start raising fund two before they have any idea whether they make good investments. What they really care about is getting logos on their website. If I, as a first-time VC, can get companies you've seen or heard of on my website and say, I'm an investor in Allbirds or whatever cool thing startup there is right now, that looks really good. So it kind of is a little weird to say, but because they obviously care about the financial outcomes of the investments, but a lot of VCs, especially when they're on their first or second fund, what they really care about is like, do people recognize the logos? Can I get into good deals? And then consensus is another big one. A lot of other forms of investing, if folks like stock market investing, hedge funds, all the incentives, whoever makes the most money, you have to be non-consensus and right. So you have to have a point of view on the world that ends up being right in a way that's different from everyone else. Venture capital largely does not work that way. You are incentivized so that you're to invest in hot areas. Right now, what are they? AI, biotech, space, right? Where like you do not probably like VR, AR. That's a great example. That was really hot and everyone invested in it. And then you had a total winter on VR, AR. You could not raise money out of a VR company. And now after Facebook rebranded, it's hot again and everyone wants to invest in it. VCs want to follow the crowd. They do not want to be the one person investing in an area. Why is that? Because they can't get people to follow on their investments if they're the only one investing in an area. You may see some VCs that are like kind of esoteric and niche, have like very targeted investment thesis, but by and large, they want to go with the crowd. Okay, how to raise from VCs. A couple of high-level insights to think about. Network. VCs, there's a common saying in the industry that VCs invest in lines, not dots. They want to have seen your company make progress over time. They don't want you to just show up and say, I want investment tomorrow. Be in the right market, I mentioned that. Scarcity. Because reputation matters so much, a lot of really savvy entrepreneurs know how to sort of play VCs off each other and make it feel like all these VCs want to invest in my company. And if you can get to that point where the VCs are coming to you, you're in really good stead. And that's kind of what I said. Those last two go together. Maximize leverage. You want VCs coming to you, and the best way to do this is traction. View from a VC. So this is something really interesting. My buddy told me 3 of the last 6 deals he invested in were companies where he had a relationship with them for over a year prior to doing his first investment with them. And that just kind of shows you that, like, to me, really hits that lines, not dots home. They want to be able to talk to you early and track your progress over time because they're going to want to project that line forward to understand what your trajectory is going to be as a company. Okay, what? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question on one of the previous slides.
Yeah.
The one before that. So if the consensus is to get a heat map of VCs on a targeted industry, from an entrepreneurial perspective, what is going to make me incentivized to choose X venture capitalist firm versus another? Is it they're reflecting on their return on investment, or what is it that is going to attract me knowing that they are not niche to my industry?
Yeah, so I will, there's a bunch of different views on this.
Okay.
I'll share my number one thing and come back to it. It's who you can build trust with the most. Like, it is a relationship business. And if a VC invests in your company, they may be part of you and your company's life for the next decade or more. And so it's about trust and character. In my point of view, I would strongly recommend going with a VC that who really believes in you and really believes in your company and that you trust them and their character over the brand name VC or the VC that's like maybe the most sophisticated in your industry. But other people would say, no, get the Andreessen Horowitzes on your cap table and then you can raise from anyone. Or they may say, hey, if you're a biotech company, you need biotech VCs. So there's differing opinions. I would emphasize the relationship side of things.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, yeah, so I was just one slide early. A couple things. What raising venture capital actually means. So it is a one-way door. This is really important. Once you raise venture capital, there's no take back seat, right? Like you are on the train and it is extremely hard to get off. You are basically, what you are signing up for is you are going to be fundraising at least every 18 months for the rest of your company's life. And you are going implicitly and explicitly going to be aiming to take your company public. Not every venture capital company, there are other ways to exit, but what you're aiming at pretty much in most industries is an IPO. So there are very few soft landings. I mentioned a 10-year commitment. Trust and character is definitely what I would optimize for. And then something, you own less of your company. You don't have control of your company's destiny anymore, is one aspect of lower ownership. And there's a very real financial implication of you don't own as, aren't able to capture as much of the upside in a positive financial windfall scenario. So that's just the realities of the situation. So something to think about. So my friend's view, he mentioned this on dilution. The solution to dilution is execution. Kind of fun, kind of foible, but also it makes sense too. Like I think this is true. If you execute and get traction, that will overcome whatever dilution you may be experiencing. Dilution is not a bad thing per se. You just want to be, it's a reality of the situation. So the takeaway, VC, venture capital, is a really powerful tool for the right kind of business. But what I would argue is that venture capital is not right for every business or even most businesses. And it's not right necessarily for all people either. Couple of things I want to leave you with. Venture capital, the best way I've heard it described is as rocket fuel, which is super important if your company is a rocket. But if you're building a motorcycle, venture capital will kill your company. Like it will not survive. It will not have a positive outcome if you raise capital and your company is not built for that kind of hypergrowth. For better or for worse, VCs would rather your company go out of business than limp along. I kind of talked about that earlier. All those incentives around funds and life and raising. And you can now, the day you raise venture capital, you can be fired from your own company. All the controls you have in place, this is just reality of the situation. You can be fired. And many startups, even big public companies, their founders are either not at the helm or in some president emeritus role, which is getting fired while still making a ton of money to just sit on the sidelines. So that may be an okay outcome too. Pros and cons of VC, ignore the colors, those are meant to be green. I just apparently also colorblind. So pros, hypergrowth, right? If you're building a rocket ship, you have got to have venture capital. In most cases, or in many cases, status. Not only is it kind of a cool, sexy industry, but VCs help you attract talent and customers. And it allows you to raise money before you have any revenue. Downsides, you don't have control, you don't have flexibility, and there are economic implications to raising VC. Before I hop into some alternatives I want to highlight. Any questions on venture capital?
What do you think the current success rate is?
I mean, depends on what you define as success. I think the rough estimate in terms of like the number of startups that have an exit is maybe like any exit at all is around 5 to 7%. Those that IPO is probably 0.5 to 0.7%. So it is a low chance positive. It is a swing for the fences kind of industry. Do you have a question, Chip?
If a company, if you aren't considering going public, would you automatically rule out VCs?
Depends on the industry. I would say there are definitely industries where there's a very active M&A market. Food and beverage is one of them where I don't know, I can probably think of one, but the vast majority of food and beverage companies get gobbled up by like a Kellogg or a P&G or something like that. So it's industry specific in terms of like what the exit opportunities are. But in general, most industries, what the VC will have you aiming for is an IPO. There are plenty of good outcomes where you may still 5 or 10x a VC's investment and exit to a strategic acquirer, but that's not what they're going to be pushing you towards. So something to think about there.
Where you going? Can you piggyback on Mike's question about success? So you answered that question from the perspective of the ventures. But what about from the perspective of VCs, the industry writ large? You alluded to it earlier about the likelihood that they will not actually receive a carry. But do you want to share anything about the success rate of venture firms?
Yeah, it's a great push. So venture capital firms as an industry, I don't have the latest numbers off the top of my head, but in general, just like startups follow a power law, VCs follow a power law as well. A handful of venture capital firms make the majority of returns for the industry as a whole. So as is the case with multiple aspects of venture capital and technology industry, the rich get richer, and like the really big name, high performing venture capitals make up, I think it's even strong, like I'd say 20% of firms make 80% of the money in the industry. If anything, it's actually probably even more extreme, and 5 or 10% of the firms make up the rest. So, and I think the median returns for a venture capital firm is like breaking even, if not negative. As an asset class, that's not great, but everyone gets really excited by the potential that they could invest in a VC that, 10x's their money or triples their money. As an investor, when you think about the long-term stock market return, risk-adjusted return being roughly 7%, people get excited about venture capital, but the industry as a whole, it's one of the during most time periods, it's one of the poorer performing asset classes. Does that all track with your BOD? Okay, cool. All right, alternatives. So venture capital is not the only option. I am going to highlight a bunch of alternatives and then provide you my perspective on some. I tossed some in the appendix, but I'm going to talk about these other ones in a bit more detail. Friends, family, and fools. We affectionately refer to this round as the FFF round. Most people say friends and family, but that's a little inside baseball for you. So this is basically raising money from personal connections. A lot of startups do this. A lot of entrepreneurial businesses as a whole do this. Pros and cons. So pro and con, you're dealing with unsophisticated investors. Your grandma's going to give you money, whether your idea is bad or not. And that could be a good or bad thing depending on how you look at it, but it definitely will give you some extra pressure because you do not want to light your uncle's retirement on fire or anything like that. And I promise you, it will also increase the hassle. So this is a good way to get some money when you don't have much traction or anything, but it will be a headache down the road, especially depending on whether they're accredited investors. Lawyers do not want you to raise this money, but it's an option. Angel investors, this is like one step up in sophistication. So these are high net worth individuals who invest personally in startups. Angels can be a bit of a mixed bag. One thing for sure to say about angels, there are way better ways to make money than investing in startups as just a random person. And so they're doing it because they do care. And I think that's largely a good thing. They care, they want to support you, they want to be involved in your company, but that also has a double-edged sword. Just because someone was successful in their industry does not mean their insights are super relevant to your industry. So if you can find a good angel that has relevant expertise, it is probably the cheapest money you will ever get on your cap table. A good angel can literally make your company successful. But that's relatively few and far between. And I would say in general, all angels want a little, as someone who has done some angel investing, angels tend to want their hand held a little bit and probably want a personal touch that is more than the amount they invest in your company necessarily warrants. So that's some downside. But they could, if they have good connections, if they have good experience, really, really Accelerators, venture studios. So I just sort of bracketed these together. Accelerators are probably more prevalent, but these are companies that will, in theory, these are funds that they will kind of help you through a cohort-based system, teach you how to do, user discovery or wireframes, and they'll have mixers with other entrepreneurs and teach you other skills, which can be really appealing if you are, if this is your first venture. And then venture studios are a bit more hands-on. It's kind of varies, but often I would say like they may have engineers on staff that will like help you with your product's development. Big item here to call out, do your homework. Unfortunately, some accelerators, some venture studios are kind of take advantage, to be honest, of new entrepreneurs. So make sure if you are going to participate in an accelerator or talk to people who have done it before. What I can promise you is if you do this, if you go this route, it is the most expensive money you can possibly raise. The kind of fees, add-ons, that because they're offering you all these services, they're basically going to make the argument that they're offering you in-kind services in lieu of investment. And so this will be the most expensive capital you can raise, in my opinion. But if you find the right firm that actually helps, that may be worth it. Strategic partners, or CVC. CVC stands for corporate venture capital firm. So a lot of large companies have their own in-house venture capital firm. Capital One has a corporate venture capital arm. Google, all the big tech companies do. And but strategic partner doesn't necessarily mean you're just getting investment from their CVC. This a lot of times people really aim at this because when done right, this sends a very, very strong signal to the market. If you are building a new social media app and Meta invests in your startup, how's that going to look for other customers? How's that going to look for a client for raising? Super strong market signal if a strategic investor who in theory knows the industry you're playing in better than anyone else thinks there's something worth investing in your startup for. But there's some downsides too. A lot of CVCs basically have all the same downsides as other venture capital firms. So see the pros and cons of venture capital. And they have different priorities, and these priorities can change. So a new CEO comes in, or a new vice president who has reporting ownership over the corporate venture arm comes in, and their priorities can totally change on a dime. So that can be frustrating, but it can also be a good thing if they are, they may be investing in you with an eye towards a potential acquisition down the road. So that may be an exit opportunity as well. Other downside, venture capitalists are notoriously difficult to raise from. Corporate venture and strategic, even harder. So, but worth a shot. Grants and development loans. So every state, municipality, large institutions have grants to try to foster innovation. Awards, I'm sure William and Mary has a litany of like things you can qualify for awards. And these can be really good. They can give you money to help support your venture, and generally they're non-dilutive. But my one call out is that does not mean there's no strings attached. There's usually things you have to jump through that can be bureaucratic or relatively onerous to get a relatively small portion of money. If you're just starting out, these can be really helpful. And it's nice that you're raising money without dilution, but just be aware that the amount of money that a local government, the amount of work you'll have to put in to get $1,000 from the local government is so much more work. I said accelerators was the most expensive money you can get. This is definitely like the hardest in terms of effort, bang for buck that you can get, but has some nice upside. Okay, bootstrapping. So I broke this section out a little bit. Bootstrapping, this is kind of like the classic narrative of like you are just hacking away on your startup and you are only eating ramen noodles because that's all you can afford because you're self-funding your startup. This has some positives, some negatives. It's all on you, and that is a very powerful motivator. But the downside is it's also all on you. You don't necessarily have support. And the reality is, despite the narrative of kind of the genius dropout, this is not how most entrepreneurial ventures are built. And if they are, it's usually for a very relatively short amount of time that someone's not taking any salary or getting any support and just hacking on a server. Okay, last option I will talk about, the holy grail of funding, in my opinion, revenue financing. Doesn't get talked about a lot, but it is really cool, and I kind of refer to it as pro bootstrapping. People often group this up with ramen bootstrapping, but I think they're completely different. The idea behind this one is to actually organically grow your venture based on real revenue from real customers. And the really powerful thing that in my opinion, revenue financing gives you is it gives you flexibility. You can continue, if you're actually thinking about your business model from the very beginning and making sure you have paying customers, A, that's a good sign that you're onto something, and B, that gives you the optionality to continue funding your venture via revenue, or you can raise money down the road. And so that's, I see as a big pro. If you do get massive organic leverage or growth, that gives you a lot of leverage with venture capitalists or whoever you submit raise from down the road, but that's not a guarantee. And you're actually bringing some money in, which is nice if you have like a family or responsibilities or a mortgage or anything, or rent. Double-edged sword here, it's hard to prioritize if you're a side project or something like that. But there is some upside here, right? Like if you, and this is something I think about for myself, is if there's not something I am excited enough about to spend my nights and weekends working on it, open question, is it worth working on? Something to think about. So that can be a positive too if you think of it as a filter function. These are all companies that basically some of them raised money eventually, but they were already $100 million plus companies when they did. These are all companies that revenue finance. This is not as impressive as a list as my first slide on venture capital companies, right? This isn't the Facebooks and Googles of the world, but these are still some heavy hitter companies. A lot of these companies are public, massive companies. So this is a totally legitimate way to build a very strong, very large, very impactful company, but do it in probably a more measured, organic way than just injecting venture capital. How to revenue finance. So I kind of think of it as like a feedback loop. 3 pieces: generate, validate, iterate. Generate. So think of pain points that you and your friends are experiencing and come up with solutions. Test the hypothesis. You don't need software engineers to do that. You can do surveys, no-code tools. You can interview people with a goal of like find a handful of people willing to pay you $1 of real money for whatever you propose, and then iterate from there. And I kind of have this like cool graphic. This took me like way too long to like put together, but like I just kind of want to demonstrate that it's through the highs and lows. If you keep this feedback loop, like keep looking at what the challenges are, come up with solutions, test them out, double down on what's working, and cut loose what's not. In general, that is a really good path to grow your business with. So how should you build your venture? Largely, that's up to you. There's pros and cons to every approach. My big thing when I talk with entrepreneurs, when I was a VC, when I was pitching VCs for startup ideas I had, was I want all of you to go in with eyes open about the pros and cons of this. Venture capital is not bad. Bootstrapping is not bad. They just have different trade-offs. And so make sure the biggest issues I've seen in my career are when someone raises venture capital thinking they're getting one thing and they're getting something very, very different. That is no fun, and you're locked into that relationship for a long time. So make sure if the company you're building is right for venture capital, make sure you know what you're getting into and know the pros and cons, and then get into it. I asked Graham if he could provide me with a soapbox, but I don't see one around. I'm going to step on my metaphorical soapbox and tell you how I think you should build your company, knowing nothing about it. How I will build my company. 2 options that are like part of the popular narrative. venture capital. If you have a company that's right for venture capital, if you're trying to build the next SpaceX, you're gonna need to raise a lot of venture capital. So if it's the right company for VC, go that route, know what you're getting into. Other than that, bootstrap, grow your company in an organic way, fund your business with revenue, think about your business model from the very beginning, and that will give you optionality to either hop on the VC train later or just build a normal non-venture backed business that you own a lot more of, but you maintain optionality. Those are two options, but I want to advocate for a third. And what I think of as the third way of building. And this is build a lifestyle business. This is a total anathema to VCs. We use this as like a bad word around the office. It's like, oh, they're just building a lifestyle business. But actually, like as I've spent more time in and around the industry and working in different ways, and like I'm super wise. I just had a kid, so my wisdom just got leveled up like so far. I would really consider this as an option for your entrepreneurial venture. Build a business that suits your lifestyle. Don't necessarily just optimize for an exit. Find something that gives you control and flexibility and work you love and a good lifestyle for you and your family. It's a really legitimate option. And this actually, if you talk to a lot of entrepreneurs out there, this is what a lot of entrepreneurial ventures are, and really successful people that we would think of as rich are just built a company and they kept growing and they kept working through problems with solutions for it. So what are the benefits of this way? It's a process, a long-term process over time of honing your craft over just building for some specific outcome. And I would say the biggest question is, what is fun to you but work to others? What could you see yourself working on for 5 years, 10 years, for the rest of your life? It doesn't have to be tech. It could be a coffee shop. It could be t-shirts. It could be whatever you want. But if you really care about it, you're going to be willing to put in more time and effort than your competitors. And you're going to be thinking about it in the shower and on a walk with your dog and all sorts of other places if you really care about what you're working on and the problem you're solving. And the third important thing about this, again, on my soapbox, I think part of the downside of venture capital is it incentivizes entrepreneurs to shove their products down customers' throats and light a ton of money on fire on advertising and that sort of thing. Focus on solving real problems for real people. And like the success will come. If you do that, your company will be successful. This is something in my own personal journey I've like had to come to grips with. But instead of trying to save the world, like build something that improves someone's life in a small way and kind of take it from there would be my advice. Start small and work outwards from that. I know that's a little soapboxy, but this is not part of the general entrepreneurship narrative. And I think it should be, because when I think of the successful entrepreneurs I know, they built this way, by and large. So conclusion, VC is not the only funding option. It's super powerful in the right circumstances, but not all businesses are right for it. If you are, I think you could do a lot worse than pursue revenue financing and try to organically grow a business. You can always raise money down the road. And think about the third way. I know it's not as cool, I know it's not as glamorous, but I think if you holistically think about your job satisfaction and how much you're working and the impact you're having, building something that looks more like a lifestyle business is going to be a lot more fulfilling than trying to chase after the VC goals. At least that's how I'm thinking about entrepreneurship these days. So I hope that was helpful. I have a little bit of time for any questions, and I also just want to highlight, like, I threw a bunch of resources that I've read all these things or have them like recommended to folks. I think I've actually read all of these, but these are a bunch of resources on like venture capital, entrepreneurship, business, no code tools that I've used for like testing prototypes and stuff. So definitely check those out. But that's what I've got. That's my presentation, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So you mentioned that valuations would vary based on geography. Would you also say that the third way, as you described, the appetite for that would vary in a similar way on geography? do you see the influence of various geographic regions of one method or another being more popular or accepted?
Yeah, I mean, there's the dinner party question, right? Like what sounds cool? Well, I thought it would be really cool to tell people I was a venture capitalist at dinner parties, and most people are like, a venture capitalist? And especially in Ohio, so it definitely does depend. I think especially like big East Coast cities, I mean, this is harder because it's really expensive to live. Or especially like things like bootstrapping may be harder. So there are definitely some geographic factors. And yeah, so I think there does vary, but I don't think there's anywhere in this, something I learned, especially being a VC in the Midwest, like you can raise venture capital anywhere. My wife's company, she joined as at a startup and she was part of the team that took it public and they're based in Columbus, Ohio. But the inverse is also true. There are plenty of people who are bootstrapping or building lifestyle businesses in New York or San Francisco. So, I think there probably is some like geographic impact in terms of like what the skew is and what the peer group is going to be doing, but I don't think it precludes you from pursuing any of these paths.
Ask us a favor, I like your resources. I miss getting them. Could you show
We'll get
us
the
the last
slides.
couple slides?
Yes, yeah, sure.
We'll get to all the slides to you.
Oh, okay.
And those are probably linked.
And
Yeah, they're linked in the slides, so you can just click on the link.
excellent, thank you.
Like small business loans. Yeah, so small business loans are not what they used to be, I would say. I think there's an idea that you can like get an SBA and that will fund your business. And I think that's somewhat outdated. There definitely are options out there. I would bucket it in the same view, in the same perspective as like the grants side of things where it will make you jump through a lot of hoops to get that for a relatively small amount of money, but it's out there, it's worth looking into. I just think for most entrepreneurial ventures, anyone who's gonna give you a loan, you're gonna have to get them comfortable with a level of risk that is hard for them to get behind. Maybe for some very specific types of loans. I did have like a bullet point on the bootstrapping about like debt financing in general. People do use debt to finance entrepreneurial ventures, credit cards, loans from family. Actually, second mortgages is one of the most used ways to finance entrepreneurship in the country statistically. You want to be very careful with those because it's very risky personally, but it's worth looking into. And if it's an option, so I would look into that. SBA loans. I think it's a bit harder depending on the kind of venture you're doing, but if you're starting a more traditional lifestyle business, and you can actually like share a full-on business plan with like estimated revenue and that sort of thing, definitely worth looking into. And those exist to incentivize entrepreneurship, so hopefully they will.
Piggyback on that. Maybe a version of that I thought was where you were going with revenue financing, but can you speak at all about like factoring or, you know, accounts receivable financing, which isn't actually what you were saying with that. The beauty of what you said with that is essentially like build a really strong business with a real business model.
Yeah.
Which I love. But can you talk a little bit about those other forms of actual?
Yeah, so I actually have I have a slide in the appendix about what I call like experimental financing. Every year you're going to see someone who says, hey, I have solved venture capital. All these downsides Eric talked about, I can offer you all the upsides of venture capital without any of the downsides. They're out there. They're worth looking into. They don't have a great track record, to be honest. But I think this is a space that's ripe for innovation. So I think there's opportunities for people to think about entrepreneurial financing different. In terms of like financing accounts receivable or even revenue financing was a big one a few years ago. There are definitely options out there that's worth exploring. It very much, I think, is contextual dependent. And it's kind of like a nice problem to have if you have the kind of like revenue or accounts receivable that someone will offer you to like give you money to finance that like cash flow stream. You already have some traction. So it's definitely out there. It's definitely worth looking into. The experimental stuff, yeah, a little bit of a mixed track record, but there's always some latest and greatest new option to finance a venture. So a little bit buyer beware, but definitely worth looking into.
Have you, excuse me, have you seen this is somewhat adjacent to venture capital and capital raise for entrepreneurship, but there's been a growing incentive to sell a future value of your home, the equity value of your home. Has there been any parallel or analogous thing for VCs or for capital for the future anticipated value of a venture and getting a cut back on that, the present value of that amount?
Yeah, so that's a lot of what those kind of experimental ventures, they try to, it's kind of like revenue or profit sharing agreements, is what a lot of those come down to. So they give you what looks like venture capital. And if you become like a high growth VC startup, it looks like venture capital and may like turn into equity. But if you turn into more of a lifestyle business, there's ways to have them get paid back through sharing in your profit. So that exists. Again, bit of a mixed track record. Like the firm that pioneered that, from my perspective in the space, there's a firm called Indie VC, and they stopped investing. So not a super strong endorsement of that, but
Right.
it exists. And probably the biggest one right now that I know of is called the Calm Fund, and it's basically marketed as offering some of the benefits of VC to more calm companies that are trying to be more sustainable and organic. I don't know anyone who's ever taken capital from them, but something to look into.
Thank you.
Sure.
Kind of piggybacking on Graham's question. When entrepreneurs were pitching you as a VC, did they often only need like receivables financing or inventory financing rather than the help of the VC? And they just couldn't see it.
Largely no. I think there's a different world. So I was a seed investor. So this was like often, two gals in a garage with a patent were the kind of companies that I was evaluating. And so there was so little traction there that they weren't making sales. Pre-revenue largely, or like very limited traction. I do think there probably is a like space along the spectrum where, when I think of like receivable financing or like equipment financing or things like that, it's more of a question of like cash flow timing. Whereas most of the companies I evaluated with, they needed capital to like hire people and fund operations. So there's probably a space on the capital continuum where that becomes a really big issue that people like that there is a pain point for. But at like kind of seed level venture capital, early tech startup, I didn't see a lot of that.
In 30 seconds or less, biggest turnoff when on the receiving end of a pitch from a founder for funding?
That's a good one.
So the number one is like, if you clearly didn't even check my company's website and like you're coming with like at a stage, or like my company was, a lot of our seed funding was only Ohio focused, and then our later Series A funding was only Midwest focused. So if you reached out to me and you're like a company in the Bay Area, it's like, dude, you did not even take 20 seconds to like look at our website. So that, I think that is always, or, especially for VCs that invest in niche area. If you're a biotech VC and someone is pitching you like marketplace, I tried to respond to all my emails, but those I was very tempted to just like ignore, because it was it just like showed that if an entrepreneur doesn't even like do the basic homework, and it's very clear that they didn't, it's tough to be super eager to engage with them.
Thanks, Erik.